And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome aboard. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Monday, March 24th, 2025. Starting with the state of the sea ice, we are near the maximum extent of the wintertime ice. That usually occurs near the end of March, early April. And given the fact we have had colder Arctic air push its way southward across the eastern Bering and west side of the mainland, that air now, that Arctic air is pushed all the way south of the eastern Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula. And there has been some southward drift of the pack ice. We're not expecting to get too much further south, but nevertheless, ice is in place. We've seen some redevelopment even into areas of Bristol Bay. So that'll be the case to close out the week. There is also a fair amount of heavy freezing spray outside of Kuskokwim Bay, within Bristol Bay and along the Pribilofs. That will continue through this Monday night, but begin to fall off on Tuesday into Wednesday as those winds lighten up. And looking at the synoptic map for late tonight, early Tuesday morning, there's an area of low pressure just south of the Gulf with a trough extending eastward. This trough's going to rotate up through the Panhandle along the northern Gulf Coast Tuesday into early Wednesday, and that'll just kind of enhance any snow, rain showers across the Panhandle later tonight, especially on Tuesday. Back further west, this gale force front will start to lose some of its punch. Will not be as strong as it crosses the central Aleutians on Tuesday and begin to weaken. By Tuesday afternoon, we have that front or trough that's just up there along the Panhandle into the northern Gulf Coast with a temporary enhancement to the precipitation there. And then by the time we get into Wednesday, that all that's left is this lingering trough along the Gulf Coast. There's a stronger low down near 970 millibars, well off the Pacific Northwest coast of the U.S. and Canada. And that low will try to pull back some moisture toward the southern Panhandle by the time we get into Thursday. But in the meantime, we're looking at winds to be northerly 10 to 15 knots, Lynn Canal, Stevens Passage, waves 2 to 3 feet. Southeast winds 15 knots or so. Dixon Entrance, waves 3 feet around Ketchikan, Metlakatla, maybe as high as 9 feet off of Craig. As we go up along the outer coast, southeast winds will become easterly around 20 knots, falling off to, or 25 knots, falling off to 20 knots up toward Cape Suckling. And waves generally 7 to as high as 9-10 feet south of the icy strait down to Sitka. And then on Wednesday, northerly winds will be the case here for the inner channels, strongest 20 knots with gusts to 35 knots, Lynn Canal, with waves of 4 feet. North winds 20 knots, 3-foot waves, Stevens Passage, and north winds 15 knots with 2 3-foot waves, Dixon Entrance. And then for the outer coast, we're looking at generally offshore flow from the northeast at 15 to 20 knots and waves of 5 to 6 feet. Along the northwestern Gulf, winds within Prince William Sound on Tuesday will be out of the northeast at 10 knots with 2-foot waves. Outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance to Kayak Island, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, 7-foot waves. Coming down the length of Cook Inlet, northeast, and then north winds of 20 to 25 knots. Waves will be a bit higher once you get off of Anchor Point and down to Kennedy Entrance, running around 5 feet. And then on Wednesday, winds come down further. Variable winds around 10 knots within Prince William Sound, 2-foot waves. Northeast winds from Kayak Island outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance to off the eastern Kenai at 15 knots with waves of 5 feet. And then upper and middle Cook Inlet, look at northeast to north winds 10 knots, waves running a couple of feet before turning northwesterly out of Kamishak Bay with waves around 3 feet through lower Cook Inlet and Kennedy Entrance. Winds across Kodiak Island on Tuesday will be northwest to north at 15 to 20 knots. As we go down the length of the Alaska Peninsula, strongest winds through some of the gaps. North Pacific side, northwest winds 30 knots, waves running 3 to 5 feet. On the Bering side, we still have northwest to north winds as high as 25 knots, especially there north of Cold Bay with waves of 8 feet. And then on Wednesday, north-northwest winds 15 knots in the vicinity of Kodiak Island. Northwest winds across the Alaska Peninsula, generally in the 15 to 20 knot range with waves 2 to 3 feet on the North Pacific side and 2 to 4 feet on the Bering side. Now, as we look at the Aleutians on Tuesday, the remnants of that front crossing the central Aleutians, ahead of it, south winds as high as 30 knots in the vicinity of Atka, but otherwise still northerly winds beginning to relax far eastern Aleutians around Dutch Harbor on Alaska, but turning southerly right ahead of that front or trough, and then behind it, winds are out of the southwest to west right around 25 knots, back west of Adak through Shemya. And for Wednesday, as that ridge of high pressure builds over the central Aleutians and extends northward into the lower Bering, we'll have northwest winds, eastern half of the Aleutians 15 to 20 knots, becoming variable near Adak, and then turn back toward the south-southwest around 15 knots, especially in the vicinity of Kiska and Shemya. Along the west and southwest coast, looking at north-northwest winds 15 to 20 knots out of Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays. However, ahead of that approaching front, we have southeast winds and east winds to 15 knots at St. Matthew, St. Paul. Generally north winds across Norton Sound, lower Yukon Delta at 15 knots. And then for Wednesday, winds come down even further. We're looking at north-northwest winds 10 to 15 knots out of Kuskokwim, Bristol Bay. Just variable winds in the vicinity of the Pribilov Islands. And then along the lower Yukon coast and Norton Sound, winds are going to generally be out of the north at only 5 to 10 knots. And then across the Bering Strait, south of the Bering Strait, look for north-northwest winds of 10 knots from the west side of the Seward Peninsula to the north side of St. Lawrence Island. Lower Chukchi Sea winds are going to generally be out of the west-northwest around 10 knots, but as we get up toward Wainwright, and there eastward all the way along the Beaufort Sea coast, generally east winds at 15 knots for Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, those easterly winds are going to strengthen from Kaktovik through Prudhoe Bay to 25 knots, and then 20-knot easterly winds from Utqiagvik down through Wainwright. Through the lower Chukchi Sea, winds turn north and then northwesterly and then finally westerly into Kotzebue Sound at about 10 knots. And south of the Bering Strait, we expect north-northwest winds around 10 knots on the north side of St. Lawrence Island, as well as the west side of the Seward Peninsula from Wales down to Nome.